The air in the Peterson implement showroom in the spring of '67 hung thick with the smell of new rubber and fresh paint, a scent that promised power and progress. It was a sweet, intoxicating smell, the kind that made a man's palms itch for a steering wheel, and his mind dream of straight furrows and record yields. Gleaming under the long fluorescent lights stood the future of farming, or so they said. A row of John Deere new generation tractors, their green and yellow hides so shiny you could see your face in them. They were big, powerful machines with names like 4020 and 5020, boasting features that sounded like science fiction to a man raised on a Farmall H, closed-center hydraulics, power shift transmissions, and enclosed cabs with radios and heaters. Most of the farmers from around the county were there, kicking tires and talking in low, reverent tones. They walked around the machines like they were prize bulls at the state fair. And right in the center of the biggest huddle was Richard Miller, holding a pen like it was a scepter. He was signing the last of the paperwork for a brand new 4020 diesel, complete with a fully enclosed cab. He was only 28, same age as me, but he carried himself like he'd already conquered the world. His father had left him a good piece of ground, and Rich was determined to double it before he was 30. His method was simple: borrow, buy, and expand. The bank, he always said, was just another tool, like a plough or a combine. I hadn't come for the spectacle. My reason for being there was a lot humbler. I was standing at the parts counter in the back, my hands stained with the grease I couldn't quite scrub out from under my fingernails. I needed a new magneto gasket and a set of points for my 1951 Farmall M. The old girl had started running a little rough, missing under load when I was pulling the disc through the North 40, and I figured it was time for a tune-up before planting season hit full swing. "Just the gasket and points today, Jed?" Old man Peterson asked, his glasses perched on the end of his nose as he rummaged through a dusty cardboard box. "That'll do her, Mr. Peterson, and a can of that Marvel mystery oil if you've got it." He slid the small parts across the wooden counter, worn smooth by decades of farmers' elbows. As I counted out the cash from my worn leather wallet, the crowd up front let out a little cheer. Rich Miller was shaking hands with the salesman, a big, toothy grin plastered on his face. He saw me standing in the back and sauntered over, the crisp new loan papers clutched in his hand. "Still pouring money into that old relic, Jedediah?" he asked, his voice loud enough for a few of the other farmers to turn and listen. He leaned against the counter, tapping his paperwork on the wood. "You know, for what you'll spend keeping that thing running this year, you could make the down payment on a real tractor." I pocketed my change and picked up the small paper bag with my parts. "She runs fine, Rich, and she's paid for. That's more than I can say for some." A couple of the older men chuckled at that, but Rich just smiled, unbothered. "Paid for doesn't get the crop in faster. Paid for doesn't let you work when it's 10 degrees out or 95. This new 4020, he patted the papers, this is an investment. It'll do the work of 2 of your old mills. I'll be done planting while you're still trying to get that thing started on a cold morning." "Maybe so," I said, turning to leave. "But when you're done planting, your work is just starting. You've got to pay for that investment. My M, she doesn't ask for much. A little gas, a little oil, and a bit of my time. She doesn't send a bill from the bank every month." Rich shook his head, a look of pity on his face. "You're thinking too small, Jed. This is the new age. You gotta use credit to get ahead. Land prices are going up, grain prices are strong. The man who hesitates now is going to be left in the dust." He gestured around the showroom. "Look around. Every smart farmer in this county is upgrading. You're going to be the last man running a tractor from the Korean War." He wasn't wrong. I saw my neighbours, good men I'd known my whole life, signing papers just like Rich. They were trading in their trusty old Farmalls and Olivers, tractors that had built their farms, for these new green giants. They were taking on debt like they'd never seen before, tens of thousands of dollars, all on the promise of a future that seemed endlessly bright. I just nodded. Good luck with it, Rich. I walked out of the showroom, the smell of new paint fading, replaced by the familiar scent of damp earth and diesel hanging in the spring air. I climbed into my old Ford pickup, the seat worn and torn, and headed for home. Driving down the gravel road, I thought about what Rich had said. Was I being a fool? Was I letting pride and a fear of debt hold me back from real success? My father. He'd been a cautious man. He'd lived through the Depression. Never owe a man $1 you can't pay back tomorrow, he'd always told me. He'd bought our 160 acres in the late 40s and worked himself into an early grave, nearly paying it off. When he died, there was still a small mortgage left, a weight that sat on my shoulders every single day. My goal wasn't to be the biggest farmer in the county. It was to own my land, free and clear, to stand on my own 2 feet and know that every clod of dirt, every stalk of corn, was mine. Not mine and the bank's, just mine. My old Farmall M represented that same idea. It wasn't fast or comfortable, but it was simple, it was honest, and it was mine. Every bolt and wire I knew by heart. When it broke, I didn't have to call a dealer and wait for a mechanic with a truck full of expensive specialized tools. I could fix it myself, with the wrenches that hung on the wall of my barn. Now, before we go any further with this story, I have to ask you all a question, and I want you to be honest. What's the oldest piece of equipment you still use? The one that might not be the fanciest, but you know you can always count on? It could be a tractor, a truck, or even just a set of old hand tools your grandfather gave you. Let me know down in the comments below. I'm curious to hear what workhorses are still out there, earning their keep. Back at my farm, I parked the truck and walked into the barn. There she sat, my Farmall M. Her red paint was faded and chipped, showing hints of rust where the fenders had been bent and straightened over the years. The narrow front end looked ancient compared to the wide front power steering setups on the new models. The seat was just a simple steel pan. But when I climbed up and pulled the starter rod, the engine turned over and coughed to life with a familiar, throaty roar. It was a sound of pure, mechanical reliability. I spent the rest of that afternoon giving her the tune-up. I pulled the cap off the magneto, the heart of the ignition system. The inside was clean, a good sign. I used a feeler gauge, a thin strip of metal, to set the gap on the new points, making sure it was exactly 15 thousandths of an inch. Too wide, and the spark would be weak. Too narrow, and the points would burn up. It was a delicate touch, something you learned by feel over the years. I replaced the old, brittle gasket, making sure the surfaces were clean so it would seal up tight. I checked the spark plugs, cleaning them with a wire brush and setting their gaps too. I poured a little of the Marvel mystery oil into the gas tank and the crankcase, a trick my dad had taught me to keep the valves from sticking and the engine running smooth. As I worked, I could hear the distant, high-pitched whine of Rich Miller's new 4020. He was already in the field across the road, pulling a 6-bottom plough at a speed I could only dream of. My M could only handle a 3-bottom, and even then, in the tough clay spots, I had to drop a gear and listen to the governor open up as the engine dug in. I watched him for a minute, a green speck moving effortlessly across the landscape, turning over black earth in perfect wide swathes. There was a part of me, a small, nagging part, that felt a pang of envy. His cab would be warm, the radio playing, the power steering, making the turns at the end of the row a one-handed affair. For me, turning at the end of the row was a wrestling match. I'd have to stand up on the clutch, haul back on the individual wheel brake levers, and muscle the steering wheel around. By the end of the day, my shoulders and back would ache with a deep, burning fatigue. When the wind blew from the west, I'd spend 12 hours eating dust, my face caked in a layer of grime, my eyes red and raw. Rich would go home clean. I'd go home looking like I'd been rolling in the dirt. The scorn from the community didn't take long to start. It wasn't mean-spirited, not usually. It was more like a kind of pitying concern, the way you'd talk about a relative who just couldn't seem to make good decisions. At the co-op getting feed, another neighbour, Tom Haskins, clapped me on the shoulder. "Jed, I saw you were still pulling that old three-bottom plough," he said, shaking his head. "You're never going to get your corn in on time with that rig. I just traded my 730 for a new 1030 case. The dealer gave me a great deal. You should talk to him." "The M gets the job done, Tom," I'd say. "But at what cost? You're burning daylight. Time is money, son. Time is money." At the diner in town, the morning coffee clutch of old-timers and other farmers would fall silent when I walked in. I knew what they were talking about. They were talking about Rich Miller buying another 80 acres. They were talking about the new combines and planters showing up on farms all over the county. And they were talking about Jed Stone, the boy who was too scared to take a chance, the boy who was going to get left behind, farming his little patch of ground with his daddy's old tractor. One day, the M sprung a leak in one of the hydraulic lines that ran to the lift-all pump. It was a high-pressure line, and it wasn't a drip. It was a steady, pulsing spray of hydraulic fluid that coated the side of the engine and the platform where my feet rested. It happened, of course, in the middle of planting, with 100 acres of corn yet to go in the ground and rain in the forecast for the next day. I shut her down immediately, the silence of the field suddenly deafening. The air smelled of hot metal and hydraulic oil. Rich was planting in the field next to mine. He saw me stop and drove his big 4x20 over to the fence line. He killed his engine, and the sudden quiet in his air-conditioned cab must have been a shock. He opened the door and leaned out. "Trouble, Jed?" he called over, a hint of a smirk in his voice. "Just a leaky hose," I called back, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "You want me to finish up for you? I could knock out that 100 acres in an afternoon. Wouldn't even charge you much." The offer was generous on the surface, but we both knew what it was. It was a power play. It was him showing me how much more efficient his new way of farming was. It was charity, and I wasn't about to take it. "No thanks, Rich. I'll have it fixed in an hour," he shrugged. "Suit yourself. But that storm's rolling in fast." He closed his cab door. The engine purred back to life, and he was off again, his new 6-row planter putting seed in the ground with perfect precision. I, on the other hand, was covered in grease and frustration. The fitting on the hydraulic line was in a miserable spot, tucked behind the distributor and under the gas tank. My wrenches were too big to get a good swing. I skinned my knuckles twice, cursing under my breath. I had to drain the whole hydraulic system, catching the fluid in a bucket, then wrestle the old, stiff hose off the brass fitting. Then it was a 15-mile trip to town to the Napa store, hoping they had the right hose and fittings in stock. They did, thankfully. But by the time I got back, wrestled the new hose on, refilled the system, and bled the air out of the lines, I'd lost over 3 hours. The sun was getting low, and the first dark clouds of that storm were building on the horizon. I fired up the M, raised and lowered the planter a few times to make sure the hydraulics were working, and got back to it, I planted until I couldn't see the marker track in the dirt anymore, the tractor's single headlight cutting a weak yellow beam into the darkness. The rain started just as I finished the last row. I drove back to the barn, soaked to the bone, exhausted and aching. But the corn was in the ground. I had done it myself. I hadn't had to ask for help, and I hadn't paid a dealer $200 for a farm call. It was a small, stubborn victory, but it was mine. The years clicked by. The late 60s bled into the early 70s, and for a while it looked like Rich Miller and everyone else who had bet on debt were certified geniuses. The world changed. President Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard. A massive grain deal with the Soviet Union, what they called the Great Grain Robbery, sent crop prices into the stratosphere. Corn that was $1 a bushel was suddenly $2, then $3. Land that had been selling for $500 an acre was suddenly $1,000, then $1,500. The bankers in town stopped wearing stuffy suits and started wearing cowboy boots. They were driving out to farms, practically begging farmers to take out loans. Buy more land, they'd say. It's the one thing they're not making any more of. Leverage your assets. Expand your operation. The mantra from the Secretary of Agriculture himself was, get big or get out. Rich Miller got big. He used his booming profits and the skyrocketing value of his land as collateral to borrow more money than anyone in our county had ever dreamed of. He bought the 240-acre farm to the west of me when old man Hemlock retired. Then he bought another 160 to the north. He was farming nearly 1,000 acres now. His new 4020 was already old news. He traded it in for an International Harvester 1466, a real monster with a turbocharged engine that screamed like a jet. He bought a brand new 6-row John Deere 60C600 combine with a heated cab and a grain monitor. He put up 2 massive new grain bins with automatic augers. His farmstead looked like a factory, a testament to modern industrial agriculture. And me? I just kept farming my 160 acres with my old Farmall M. The good grain prices were good for me too. But my thinking was different. I saw those $3 a bushel corn checks not as a down payment on a new tractor, but as a weapon. A weapon to kill my debt. Every spare dollar I made went straight to the bank. I didn't buy a new truck. I didn't put aluminum siding on the house. I drove the same old Ford, patched the roof on the barn myself, and ate simple meals. While my neighbors were taking vacations to Florida, I was in my shop, rebuilding the water pump on the M, or welding a crack in my old disc. The bank teller, a young woman named Sarah, would look at me funny every time I came in with another big check. "You know, Mr. Stone," she said one day, as I slid a check for $5,000 across the counter, "you could get a loan for a new tractor with this as a down payment. Your credit is excellent." "I don't want a loan, Sarah. I want this to go straight to the principal on my mortgage." She'd just shake her head and stamp my receipt. To her, and to everyone else, I was a mystery, a man sitting on a gold mine who refused to dig. Rich Miller even stopped by one afternoon, pulling his shiny new pickup truck into my messy gravel driveway. He got out and looked around at my old barn and modest house. "Jed," he said, getting straight to the point, "I'll give you $2,000 an acre for this place. Cash, that's top dollar. You could walk away with over $300,000. Buy yourself a nice place in town. Take it easy. You've earned it." "I'm not selling, Rich." "Why not? You're killing yourself working this hard with this old junk. Let me take it over. I've got the equipment to farm it right. It's a business decision, Jed. Don't be sentimental." "This land isn't just a business to me, Rich. It's my home, and I'm not interested in being your employee." He laughed, a short, sharp bark. "You're a fool, Stone. A sentimental fool. You're missing the opportunity of a lifetime." He got back in his truck and spun his tires in my gravel as he left. A few months later, in the fall of 1974, I walked into the bank with my last big check from the harvest. It wasn't for $5,000 this time. It was for $12,742, the exact amount left on my mortgage. Sarah's eyes went wide when she saw the check. She called the bank president, Mr. Abernathy, out of his office. He was an old man with a kind face who had known my father. He took the check, looked at it, and then looked at me. He broke into a wide grin and shook my hand firmly. "Your father would be proud, Jedediah. Damned proud." That afternoon, I walked out of the bank, holding the deed to my farm. The paper felt heavy in my hand, heavier than its actual weight. It was a symbol of decades of sweat, sacrifice, and stubbornness. I was 35 years old, and I didn't owe a single man on this earth a single red cent. My land, my house, my machinery, it was all mine. But as I stood on the courthouse steps, a strange feeling washed over me. In the eyes of the world, in the eyes of my neighbors and men like Rich Miller, I was a failure. I was the small-timer who had played it safe while they got rich. I owned 160 acres. Rich controlled 1,000. I drove a 20-year-old tractor. He drove a brand new one every 2 years. The boom was still going strong, and I had cashed out my chips while the game was still hot. That evening, I was listening to the radio in my kitchen, cleaning the grease from my hands. The farm report was on, full of optimistic predictions about next year's prices. But then the national news came on. The announcer's voice was grim. He talked about an oil embargo in the Middle East. He talked about inflation, a word I didn't fully understand, but he made it sound like a thief in the night. He mentioned the Federal Reserve and the possibility of raising interest rates to cool down the economy. I turned the radio off and looked out the window at my dark fields. A cold wind was blowing from the north, rattling the old window pane. Out across the road, a single bright light shone from the new machine shed on Rich Miller's farm. He was probably in there, polishing the hood of his new tractor, dreaming of the next farm he was going to buy. And I wondered if he was listening to the same news, and if he felt the same chill in the air that I did. The party had been going on for a long time, but I had a feeling the fiddler was about to ask to be paid. The good years, as it turned out, were a fever, and like any fever, it had to break. The first sign was the sky. The spring of 1978 came, but the rains didn't. The sky over the county turned a pale, hazy white and stayed that way through May and into June. The young corn, which should have been knee-high by the 4th of July, was stunted and yellow, its leaves curling inward during the heat of the day, as if in prayer for a drink. The ground in my fields turned to concrete, and great cracks opened up in the earth, wide enough to swallow a wrench. My old M didn't seem to mind the heat. It had no radiator to boil over, just a simple thermosiphon cooling system that relied on the natural circulation of water. It ran hot, but it always ran hot. I cultivated my corn, trying to break up the crust on the soil to conserve what little moisture was there. The dust was biblical. It rose in a thick, choking cloud that followed me up and down the rows, turning the green of the tractor a ghostly brown. I'd come in at the end of the day, looking like a statue made of dirt, the only clean spots being the 2 raccoon-like circles around my eyes where my goggles had been. Across the fence, Rich Miller's operation was struggling. His big, new International 1466, with its powerful turbocharged engine, was designed for heavy work in ideal conditions. In this heat, it was constantly overheating. I'd see him stop at the end of a row, the big tractor idling with steam pluming from the radiator cap. His 8-row cultivator was too much for the baked earth. I saw him one afternoon snap a shank clean off when it snagged on a patch of ground as hard as pavement. The real trouble for him started in July. I was out mending a fence when I heard the sound. It was a high-pitched scream from his field, followed by a loud bang and a great belch of black smoke. The 1466 coasted to a silent stop in a cloud of its own making. I watched through my binoculars as Rich climbed down from the cab, threw his hat on the ground, and kicked the massive rear tire. He'd blown the turbo. I knew what that meant. That wasn't a repair you could make with a set of wrenches and a can of penetrating oil. The turbocharger on that DT436 engine was a complex precision instrument. You couldn't just patch it up. It had to be replaced or professionally rebuilt, and either way, it meant a trip to the dealer. The next day, the big service truck from the international dealer was out in his field. 2 mechanics in clean overalls worked on it for the better part of the day. The bill, as I later heard Tom Haskins talking about at the co-op, was over $2,000. $2,000 just to get back in the field, and he'd lost 2 full days of cultivating during a critical growing period. My entire operating budget for a year, outside of fuel and seed, was less than that. I had rebuilt the entire engine on my M2 winters prior, putting in new sleeves, pistons and bearings, and the whole job had cost me less than $500 in parts and a few weeks of my own time. The drought broke in late August, not with gentle, soaking rains, but with a series of violent thunderstorms that flattened the already weakened crops and washed away topsoil. The harvest was a disaster for everyone. Yields were down by half, but for me, it was a disappointment. For Rich, it was a catastrophe. He had payments to make. Payments calculated on the assumption of $3 corn and 200 bushel yields. With corn prices dipping and his bins only half full, the math on his ledger sheets was starting to look terrifying. The real blow, the one that broke the back of the boom, landed in the winter of 1980. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan. In response, President Carter announced a grain embargo. Just like that, our biggest customer was gone. The bottom fell out of the market. Corn that had been flirting with $3 a bushel was suddenly worth $2.20 and falling. That was when the tone in the coffee shop really started to change. The confident talk of buying more land and bigger equipment evaporated. It was replaced by hushed, worried conversations about operating loans and input costs. The bankers who had been so friendly, driving out to farms with loan applications on their dashboards, were suddenly nowhere to be seen. Their doors, which had always been open, were now closed. Appointments were required. I saw Rich at the grain elevator that fall. He looked 10 years older than he had a few years before. His face was thin, and there were deep lines of worry etched around his eyes. He was unloading corn from a brand-new grain truck, a tandem axle GMC that must have cost him a fortune. He was trying to sell his crop straight from the field to generate cash flow rather than storing it and hoping for a price rally. He nodded at me, a flicker of the old arrogance gone from his eyes, replaced by something that looked like desperation. "Heard you had a decent crop on your South 80, Jed," he said, his voice flat. It was all right. The clay held the moisture better there. "Yeah," he said, staring at the stream of corn pouring into the pit. "I've got notes coming due. The bank, they're not as understanding as they used to be. Times are changing, Rich." He let out a bitter laugh. "You can say that again. They loan you an umbrella when the sun is shining and ask for it back the minute it starts to rain." He kicked at a loose stone on the ground. "And the damned interest rates? They're killing me. My operating loan from last spring was at 9%. The renewal came in the mail yesterday. 18%. 18. How's a man supposed to make a living on that? I didn't have an answer for him. I didn't have an operating loan. I paid for my seed and fertilizer with cash from the previous year's crop. The word interest was something I read about in the newspaper, not on a letter from the bank. "You were smart, Jed," he said quietly, not looking at me. "You sat back and watched the rest of us fools run right off a cliff." It wasn't a compliment. It was a confession. I drove home that day, feeling no sense of victory. I just felt a deep, chilling sadness. The party was over. The lights had come on, and the room was a mess. And the fiddler wasn't just asking to be paid. He was coming to break the fiddles of anyone who couldn't settle their account. The winter of 1981 was the quietest I can ever remember. The usual hum of activity on the farms around me ceased. Men who should have been in their shops, overhauling equipment for the spring, were instead sitting at their kitchen tables, staring at piles of bills. The price of land, which had been the foundation of everyone's wealth and borrowing power, began to collapse. Farms that had been appraised at $2,000 an acre were now struggling to find a buyer at $1,000. The collateral on billions of dollars in loans was vanishing into thin air. The foreclosure notices started appearing in the legal section of the county newspaper like obituaries. First it was a few, then a dozen, then a whole column. Good families, families who had farmed here for generations, were being forced out. Their crime wasn't that they were bad farmers. Their crime was that they had believed the experts. They had believed in the promise of get big or get out. The day of Rich Miller's auction was cold and grey, a miserable day in late March. A bitter wind whipped across the farmstead, carrying with it the smell of defeat. Most of the county was there, not out of spite, but out of a kind of morbid solidarity. They stood in small, silent groups, their hands shoved deep in their pockets, their faces grim. These were the same men who had cheered for Rich in the implement showroom 15 years earlier. Now they were here to watch his empire be dismantled, piece by piece. The auctioneer stood on a flatbed trailer, his rapid-fire chant echoing off the big machine shed. It was a sound that usually meant excitement and opportunity, but today it just sounded like a funeral dirge. Rich's equipment was lined up in neat, heart-breaking rows. The massive 14 S66 tractor, the Gleaner combine with the 20-foot grain head, the 6-bottom plough, the fleet of gravity wagons. It was the dream of modern agriculture, laid out for vultures to pick over. But the vultures weren't paying much. The market was flooded with used equipment from other farm auctions. A new reality had set in. A tractor was only worth what it could earn, and with corn prices in the tank, it couldn't earn much. The 1466, which Rich had probably paid $30,000 for, sold for $8. The combine, a $60,000 machine, went for $12. It was a slaughter. I watched Rich and his wife, Sarah, standing on the porch of their house. Sarah was crying silently, her arm wrapped around their young son. Rich just stood there, his face a mask of stone, watching the life he had built evaporate before his eyes. The banker was there, a man in a crisp suit who looked uncomfortable and cold, ticking off items on a clipboard as they were sold. I didn't bid on any of the big equipment. I had no need for it. But I waited. Toward the end of the sale, the auctioneer moved to the smaller items, and then, finally, to the land itself. The banker stepped forward and read the legal description. They were selling it in parcels. First, the 240 acres to the west, then the 160 to the north. The bids were sluggish, the prices heartbreakingly low. Finally, the auctioneer announced the last parcel. "All right, folks, next up we have the original Miller home place. 80 acres, with the house, The barn and the outbuildings, a fine piece of ground, right here on the main road. This was the land Rich's father had left him. This was his heart. I saw him flinch when the auctioneer said his name. The bidding started. A few of the bigger operators, the ones who had been more cautious and had survived the crash, put in low bids. A land speculator from the city offered a little more. The price crept up slowly, painfully. I thought of that day in the showroom, of Rich's arrogance and his pitying smile. I thought of his words, "You're thinking too small, Jed." Maybe he was right. Maybe I had been thinking too small, but my small thoughts had kept my head above water, while his big ideas had drowned him. I felt no anger towards him anymore, only a profound sense of waste. I stepped forward from the back of the crowd. "I'll bid," I said, my voice louder than I intended. The crowd turned to look at me. The auctioneer squinted in my direction. "Jedediah Stone. I bid 60,000. It was more than the land was worth in that depressed market, but it was less than it was worth as a home. The speculator shook his head and dropped out. The other farmers looked at me, then at Rich, and they understood. No one else made a bid. "Sold!" the auctioneer cried, his gavel falling with a sharp crack. "To Jedediah Stone." I walked over to the banker's table and wrote the check. My hand didn't even shake. It was a lot of money, the bulk of my savings. But I knew what I was buying. It wasn't just land. It was a man's dignity. After the crowd had dispersed and the last of the equipment had been hauled away, I walked up to the porch where Rich was still standing. He wouldn't look at me. "What do you want, Jed? Come to gloat? To tell me you told me so?" "No, Rich," I said quietly. "I came to make you a business proposition." He finally looked at me, his eyes full of suspicion and shame. "I'm not a landlord," I said. "I've got no desire to run a second farmstead. I want to rent this place to you, you and your family. You can live in the house, use the barn. You can farm the 80 acres. The rent will be a third of the crop, just like in the old days. No cash up front." He stared at me, speechless. His jaw worked, but no words came out. "Why?" he finally managed to whisper. "After everything, why would you do this?" "Because this is your home, Rich. It was your father's before you. A man needs a place to stand, and this county needs good farmers. You're a good farmer. You just flew a little too close to the sun." I held out my hand. We were neighbors before all this started. I figure we can be neighbors again. He looked at my calloused, grease-stained hand, then at his own, which were soft from years of sitting in a climate-controlled cab. A single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. He slowly reached out and shook my hand. His grip was firm. It was the grip of a man who had lost everything, but had just been given a reason to start over. The years that followed were lean, but they were honest. The farm crisis of the 80s reshaped our world. The ones who survived were the ones who were like me, cautious, diversified, and fiercely independent. The community's perspective shifted. My way of farming, once seen as backward and cowardly, was now called sustainable. The old men in the coffee shop started asking for my opinion on things. Young farmers, just starting out, would stop by my shop to ask how I kept the old M running, or how I managed to farm without a huge line of credit at the bank. Rich Miller became a different man. He farmed that 80 acres with a tenacity I'd never seen in him before. He bought an old John Deere 730 at a sale for a few $1,000s and rebuilt it himself in the barn I now owned. He and I didn't become best friends, but a quiet, deep respect grew between us. We'd help each other during harvest, share tools, and sometimes just stand by the fence line, watching our crops grow, not as competitors, but as fellow custodians of the land. After 5 years, he had saved up enough money to buy the 80 acres back from me, for exactly what I had paid for it, with no interest. The day he handed me that check was one of the proudest of his life. I never got big. My farm remained 160 acres. But it was a good farm. It provided a good life for me and my family. My son David grew up with grease under his fingernails, just like me. He learned how to time an engine, how to set a plow, and how to tell the difference between a want and a need. One cool autumn afternoon, sometime in the late 80s, I found him in the barn. He was about 16, a tall, strong kid with my wife's kind eyes. He was standing there, just looking at the old Farmall M. She was semi-retired by then. I'd bought a slightly newer, but still modest, tractor for the heavy work, but I still used the M for mowing and raking hay. Her red paint was almost completely gone in places, faded to a soft orange, but her engine still started on the first pull. "Dad," he said, running his hand over the worn steering wheel. "Why did you keep her all these years? All those other guys, they had the big new stuff. Weren't you ever tempted?" I walked over and stood beside him, the familiar smell of old oil and settled dust filling my lungs. I looked at the simple, rugged machine that had been the anchor of my life. Tempted? Every single day, I admitted. It's easy to want the new, shiny thing. It's easy to believe that more power and more debt means more success. But this old tractor, she taught me a different lesson. She taught me that freedom isn't about how much you can buy. It's about how little you owe. I put my arm around his shoulder. Your great-grandfather survived the Depression. He learned that the land is what matters. Your grandfather paid for most of this farm with his own sweat. He learned that a man's word and his good name are his real currency. And I learned that you can't trust a boom, because booms always end. What's left after the fever breaks is what you truly own. I pointed to the magneto, the simple ignition system I'd repaired so many times. "That thing there," I said, "it makes a spark, simple, reliable. You can take it apart and fix it on your workbench, the computer in a new tractor today. It's a black box. When it breaks, you're helpless. You have to call a man who has another computer to come and fix it. You become dependent. You lose a piece of your independence." We stood there for a long time in the quiet of the barn, the low afternoon sun slanting through the dusty windows. Outside, I could hear the distant rumble of Rich Miller's old 730 as he finished up his fall ploughing. It was a good sound. It was the sound of survival. I looked out over my fields, the corn stubble golden in the fading light. Every furrow, every fence post, every blade of grass felt like a part of me. It was all mine. Not mine and the bank's, just mine. The old Farmall M sat silent in the barn, a monument not to the past, but to a future built on a solid foundation. A future that was paid for in cash. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that it had all been worth it.